And last thing I'd like to say is let's give a warm Steamboat welcome to our National Advisory Board member and our panel moderator, Amy Oliver Cooke.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and just go sit down. Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for being here, and also Jennifer and Rick and the Steamboat Institute. First of all, I'm proud to be a part of it on their National Advisory Board, but also just for having events like tonight. I love the title of it, which is The Coming Storm. And how many of you all have seen the movie The Perfect Storm? Right? Okay, so George Clooney battling this convergence of weather systems. Well, that's sort of the way I feel or kind of view these EPA regulations. You have a system that's already here, and then you have two more on the way that are going to really, this is the perfect storm. And sadly, northwestern Colorado is sort of ground zero. This is the bullseye, and you guys are going to feel the effects of it, as are other parts of the nation, but in particular here in northwestern Colorado. And so we're thrilled to be able to present this panel to you tonight so you can hear about what some of these regulations, one that is already doing, and two that are coming sort of down the pipeline. So I'm going to introduce our panelists quickly, because the most important part of this is that you hear from each of them. And then we want you to participate. We want you to ask questions, whatever's on your mind, after they have done their opening remarks. They'll have a few minutes of opening remarks. I have a couple of questions for each of them. Then we're hoping that you all have questions that you want to ask, things that you want to know. They're here tonight to answer those questions for you. So first of all, I would like to welcome Raymond Gifford. He is a partner with Wilkinson, Barker, and Nauer in Denver. Ray counsels communications, electric and gas utilities, and information technology companies on state and federal aspects of regulation, administrative law, and competition policy. He is the go-to expert in public utilities law and law and economics of regulation of network industries. Ray also served as the chair of Colorado's Public Utilities Commission under Governor Owens, and he began his regulatory career as first Assistant Attorney General for Regulatory Law in Colorado's AG office. Now, what I love about Ray, besides being a fabulous resource, is he's an attorney that doesn't talk like one. So all of us can understand him. Welcome, Ray Gifford.
Thanks.
We're gonna introduce everybody. Okay. Yeah, and then we'll do.
I do want to say that, by the way, I'm not the PUC chairman that Amy got kicked out of the commission. So.
No, Ray's one of the good guys. All right, next up we have Dan Byers. Dan is a Senior Director for Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Institute for 21st Century Energy. Dan is responsible for leading the Institute's efforts to promote and maintain something near and dear to everybody here, coal's vital role in America's energy system. And I will say this, having seen a number of presentations on the regulation that he's going to talk about, which is the new ozone regs, the one that the Institute for 21st Century Energy puts out is absolutely far and away the best. He's also served as a staff director of Energy and Environment Subcommittee for the House of Representatives, Committee on Science and Space Technology, and during the second term of the Bush administration, Dan served from 2005 to 2009 as deputy to the Associate Director for Technology at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Now, is this one of those things, the longer the title, the less authority you have? Welcome, Dan Byers. And last, we have, but not least, certainly, you all know him, Lee Boughey. He is the Senior Manager, Corporate Communications and Public Affairs for Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association. We fondly refer to them as Tri-State. He is the Vice Chair for the Communications Council. It's part of the Electric Power Research Institute, the co-chair of Colorado's Energy Coalition. And what you may not know about Lee is that he was with the National Renewable Energy Lab. So Lee, let's just put it this way, he knows a lot about energy resources. So welcome, Lee Boughey. Real quickly, just to let you all know, so Ray is going to do some introductory remarks on the Clean Power Plan, which is the EPA's latest, the regulation that is coming down right now that we will all be subjected to. So Ray is going to address the Clean Power Plan. Dan will be talking about the new ozone regs, and I don't think it even has a formal name yet. Does it have something like the Clean Power Plan?
National Ambient Air Quality Standards for ozone.
Oh my God, you got to come up with something, they've got to come up with something better, like the Clean Power Plan, some euphemism.
They like to make it confusing.
And then Lee will be addressing the lawsuit, the Wild Earth Guardians lawsuit against the Kalawao mine. So with that, we'll start with opening remarks. Let's go to Ray Gifford.
Sure, and I have some slides that will hopefully magically appear. Here we go. And thank you, Amy, and thank you, Jennifer and Steamboat, for having us all here. It's a daunting task after Amy says I don't talk like a lawyer, and I realize that for the next 5 or 10 minutes I'm probably going to talk like a lawyer. But worse than that, I'm also a used regulator, which probably does me no credit here either. So what is the Clean Power Plan, or the 111D proposal? And I'm going to stand up just because I get so excited about this topic. What it does is aims for a 30% reduction of carbon emissions from electric generating stations everywhere in the U.S. by 2030. A lot of this rule is front-loaded to 2020, and the baseline year for examining when the carbon emissions are baseline from is 2012. Next slide. Each state, the way the Clean Air Act works, is going to get a carbon budget from the EPA. And the carbon budget is going to compel each state to come up with a plan, a state plan, that shows how they're going to meet the EPA carbon target under the Clean Power Plan. Now, what is the rule going to accomplish? If you look at this chart, you look at the yellow line up there, are the global CO2 emissions by 2030. If you look at the green line right below the yellow line, that is what the avoided carbon because of the EPA rule. There are 2 lines up there, I swear to you. So next, how does this work, and what do the states have to do, and how did we get here, and so on and so forth. Next slide. Oh, this is the slide I added this morning, and I forgot where I put it. So what else is this rule going to do? The Energy Information Administration just came out this week with a new report on what it's going to do to the gross domestic product of the United States. This is it, and the Energy Information Administration, by the way, is the U.S. Department of Energy. So what you see starting in 2020 is about a $65–70 billion decline in GDP. It peaks at about $160 billion in 2025, and by 2030, it's only down to about a $30 billion deadweight loss on the economy. But what the analysis that EIA has done shows, and it seems to be fairly neutral analysis, is there are going to be large economic costs associated with the Clean Power Plan. So what happens next? How does this work? Why are we going to do it? Next slide. So here's what the EPA does when they come up with your carbon budget. They take what are called 4 building blocks. They assume, first of all, that every coal-fired power plant in the state can get 6% more efficient. That's a 6% decline. They next decide that all of your gas-fired units in your state can run about twice as much. Gas units run at about a 40% capacity factor. EPA says they can run 70% of the time. What that does is you're displacing your coal with gas as your new baseload resource. Natural gas-fired generation has about half the carbon profile of coal. It then takes a state or a regional renewable energy standard, says you can increase your percentage of power from renewables, says that's part of your budget, and finally says demand reduction can happen at a 1.5% per year through 2030, reduction year over year of demand on the customer side. What this means practically is in Colorado, the reduction of pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour goes from 1,959 pounds per megawatt hour to 1,159. That is a 41% reduction in carbon emissions for Colorado by 2020. And then by 2030, the mandate gets to 1,108, a 44% reduction. What you see from this for Colorado, and it plays out similar in other states, is the carbon reductions are front-loaded. Now to EPA, this is a benefit, not a bug, because what it means is utilities like Lee's, utilities like Xcel Energy, Black Hills Energy, have to make decisions very quickly to retire their coal plants, build new gas plants, and start increasing their renewable energy percentage. Next slide. What EPA really wants, though, is not a state-by-state plan, but they want a multi-state plan. They want the states to band together and enter into these agreements typified by something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which 13 northeastern states are part of, and then they can trade emissions credits and allocations of carbon. And here's how this works, or at least here's how this stylistically would work. Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho enter into a regional carbon trading platform. Montana calls up Colorado and says, you know, Colorado, I think you guys should shut down your coal-fired power plants, and we're all in great shape. And Colorado says, you know, I was thinking the same thing, but I was thinking Wyoming should do it. And Wyoming says, I can't shut off a power plant because I'm supplying Idaho. And Idaho says, you can't shut off any of these plants because this is where all your capacity comes from. It's going to be a very complex process in a very short period of time. We're going to need state legislation to make it happen. We're going to make it to be enforceable by the EPA. You need a forcing mechanism. Next slide. What has now emerged as the preferred remedy, and the regional think tanks, not Independence or Steamboat, but folks like the Center for New Energy Economy in Fort Collins, Great Plains Institute in the Midwest, are pitching very hard to environmental officials in the states and PUCs a common elements trading approach where you're trading carbon credits. Again, very complex, very costly, but this seems to be where most of the states are at least being urged by the environmental advocates in this world. Next slide. So, and here's the question that Amy and I have talked a lot about and that we've emphasized. I actually brought homework for anybody who's captivated by the rule. I've got 5 white papers that explain this very quick overview in more detail. Here's one of the big problems of the Clean Power Plan, because I think every Clean Air Act lawyer in the country would have to admit fairly that EPA is going for a long pass. The legal ability of this to withstand scrutiny is a little dicey. However, EPA may not care because, again, by front-loading these deadlines, you're going to force decisions to take the coal offline sooner rather than later. And if the Supreme Court invalidates the rule in 2020, it doesn't matter because the coal's off the grid already anyway. But the other thing it asks for is for the states to do things they've never been empowered to do before. And even in our overweening administrative republic, the federal government cannot create state law powers ex nihilo. So the question is do the air regulators in all of these respective states and here have the power to order Lee's utility to run their combined cycle turbines twice as much? What do you think, Lee? No. Does the air regulator have the authority to devise, impose, and create a new renewable energy standard? How do you think Tri-State would respond to a new CDPHE RES standard? Probably wouldn't think they have that authority. And can they devise and impose an energy efficiency demand response program? Well, that's actually what EPA has told the state of Colorado to do. It's told 48 other states to do the same thing. Vermont's excluded because it doesn't have any fossil-fired power plants. But the bottom line is what the Clean Power Plan does in a very short period of time is force utilities and force states to make very dramatic decisions about their energy portfolio. It raises deep and abiding state institutional questions. And if this is all confusing to you in my 10 minutes, there are hundreds of Clean Air Act and utility lawyers around the country who are just as confused because we have no idea how it can be done. So,
we all feel better now, I think. Dan Byers on the ozone standard, which needs a new name.
Great, thanks. Well, I'll stand here if that's okay. And let me just start with a little bit of pandering that has the benefit of being true. I've been in Steamboat less than 3 hours, and I am in love. I was cranky because my flight that I had booked up to Hayden Valley was canceled last week, and so I had to drive up from Vail, and then, whoa, that's the most beautiful stretch of highway I've ever been on. So. I'm going to talk about the ozone rule. I have some slides as well, but first I want to just make a point to sort of compliment Lee's, on the Clean Power Plan. So EPA is doing these rules essentially to take over the electricity sector, and it's different than any rule in EPA history. Normally the Clean Air Act regulations are meant to address a human health pollutant, lead, particulate matter, things that we really know are genuine human health hazards. They're easily addressable. You say, we know that this level is safe for the air and for public health, and we know that this equipment needs to go on the power plant to address it, and here's how that's how you're going to do it. Climate change, this is what these rules are all about, is climate change. This is a global issue, right? And so it's important to look at the context of this rule, and Ray showed the slide showing that, what a drop in the bucket, this sort of essentially a takeover of the U.S. electricity system is just going to be a drop in the global bucket because of what China, Russia, Japan, the rest of the world is doing in terms of energy. The world is hungry for energy, and coal, whether we like it or not, has really been the source of that energy, and so that's important to keep in mind. And President Obama's legacy, this is a legacy item for him. It's his top priority between now and when he leaves office is to make sure that these regulations go into place so he can be remembered for that. And in December, this is certainly going to make news as the time nears, that he wants to ink an agreement that will be the successor to the Kyoto Protocol in Paris, and will essentially get all the countries of the world to join in. And so it's important to look to see what we're doing here in the U.S. in terms of the reductions we're making, 30% reductions for our entire electricity system, and look at the commitments that other countries are making. And I won't go into a lot of detail on that, but we signed a historic agreement with China in which China says we will peak emissions, so we're going to grow indefinitely until around 2030, and then we're not even going to tell you what level we're going to peak at, but we'll probably peak around that time. Well, we're saying we're going to cut 30%. Japan says, hey, we're moving away from nuclear, we're building coal plants, so they're going to be emitting more carbon. Germany has some of the highest electricity rates in Europe and really around the world, and they're one of our main manufacturing competitors. Their economy is being hammered because manufacturing is moving to the U.S., and so they're saying, we're going to build a lot more coal. Russia is my favorite one. Russia's commitment into this UN process to ink the global deal says we are going to limit our emissions in 2030 to 70% of their 1990 level. Sounds pretty good. What happened in 1990? Communism fell, the Russian economy crashed, and emissions crashed with it. If you look, Russia right now is 40% below their 1990 level, so they're essentially setting themselves up to increase emissions as part of their commitment, 40% between now and 2030. So that's important context to keep in mind when we think about, why are we actually doing these carbon rules? Okay, next slide. I want to talk about ozone, just a couple of quick things on ozone. So as big as the Clean Power Plan is, the ozone rule is arguably bigger in terms of its impacts on the economy. And this is really complicated, won't get into a lot of the details, but I just want to give you a sense of how it works and why it's going to be a big deal. Ratio of the slide, about 140 billion is the peak economic hit from the electricity rule, Clean Power Plan. The ozone rule, the National Association of Manufacturers estimated will also be about $140 billion a year hit. 1.4 million fewer jobs, average household reduction about $830 annually. I should actually step back a second and just say, well, what does the rule do? The rule essentially says we're going to tighten the level of ozone in the air that we think is safe for public health. What does it mean? It means areas that are currently not having to sort of go into the regulatory red tape that's associated with being above the accepted level get kicked into it. And the map on the bottom shows all the areas of the country, about 2/3 of the country are going to be in violation of the new standard. And you can see the Colorado counties on top of there. Almost every county in Colorado is going to be in violation. Right now, only Denver exceeds the current level, but when you go down to the level EPA has proposed, 65 parts per billion, most of the state will be in non-attainment. What does it mean as a practical matter? Essentially, it's a handcuff on economic development. So if industry wants to expand manufacturing, they're not going to be able to get their permit. They either have to buy offsets, they have to go through all this red tape. The state has to figure out, hey, how are we going to come back into compliance and get under this level? We can take cars off the road, we can shut down power plants, we can do sort of this package of things to try to get down under that level. EPA has a huge hammer. If a state or a metropolitan area can't make the standard, they can take away your highway funding. They can withhold your highway funding. And so you can imagine what that does. The states, localities, elected officials, they say, we got to do everything we can. We realize this is a big deal. We got to do everything we can to make sure we're going to be in compliance with the standards so we don't lose our highway funding. Next slide. I should actually step back and mention, what is ozone? Ozone is the main ingredient in smog. And when we think about smog, we think about Los Angeles, right? And maybe the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And that is definitely a genuine health hazard. It's something that we've done a really good job of addressing. And it's important for us to always point out, the Clean Air Act has been successful at cutting emissions and reducing some of these concerns to human health. We have reduced ozone emissions about by half since 1980, so there's just been basically a steady decline. That's sort of technology pushing this kind of thing. What we're moving into now, though, is just a dramatic push where it's not something that's even attainable, and as opposed to kind of pushing the edge on technology, it's just essentially going to be eliminating all these energy resources like coal in order to comply. Colorado and really the West has a huge problem with ozone. It's going to be a big problem everywhere. But Colorado has a problem because of naturally occurring background. You can see the map on the left there shows, you can see the West there, essentially the Four Corners area, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. Background levels are at about 50 to 60 parts per billion. The EPA is saying you're going to have to get down to 65 parts per billion. There's not even, so essentially what that means is you have rural areas, that's Long Peak, Rocky Mountain National Park, they're going to be in violation of the standard. There's not even any industry there to shut down to get into compliance. And so the state, again, this is something where the western states have actually joined and said, no matter what our position is on ozone and addressing it, we're not going to be able to comply. So it's a huge deal. By the way, I should mention Yellowstone will be in violation, Grand Canyon, so it kind of just shows that the level that we're ratcheting this down to is sort of ridiculous because no one thinks of Rocky Mountain Park and they don't think of it as a smog alert. But that's essentially what EPA is going to be saying when they move forward with this new standard. Next slide. I think it's the last one. Yeah. You can't see this probably very well, but I find this slide fascinating. Again, everyone here cares about the environment. We want to do everything we can to address human health concerns. But it's important to remember that the relationship between regulations and public health isn't just a one-way street. It's not all good to ratchet down. And so this comes from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, some of the best toxicologists in the world. These are government officials there. The bottom bar, which you can barely see a blip there, shows the relationship between a 10 part per billion increase in ozone and mortality, premature death. And you can see it's essentially, there's a slight correlation there, but it's almost non-existent. To give you a reference, the bar to the left, about halfway up, shows you how much reduced mortality you have from quitting smoking. So everyone knows what's, the value to your health if you quit smoking. The top bar, which I have circled, shows the increase in mortality every 10% decrease in your income. So not necessarily even completely losing your job, but simply having a cut in pay, what that does to public health and mortality. And we can understand how this works, right? I mean, if you don't have a job, or if you're tight on finances, maybe you don't eat as well, you don't take the health care visits or preventative care that you otherwise would. And so the notion that wealth equals health, and having a job is very important to public health. And if you're going to be killing 1.4 million jobs a year, you may be actually harming public health more than you're getting in terms of increased benefits from reducing the ozone. And that's an important thing that sort of gets lost in this debate. But it's going to be a big deal, and states are calling attention to it. There was a hearing on this very issue on the Hill yesterday. But this rule is coming. It will be final October 1st, and states are going to have to figure out what they're going to do to respond to it and address it. And unfortunately, we still have a chance, I think, to get EPA to set it at a more reasonable standard, but it's going to need action from elected officials all around the country to call awareness, and that's something we're working on at the chamber. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And as if you aren't frightened enough already, I don't want to say Lee's scary. Lee Boughey is not scary, but Lee, talk about the Wild Earth Guardian. Well, they're scary. The Wild Earth Guardian lawsuit against the Kalawao mine from Tri-State's perspective.
The Clean Power Plan, the ozone rule, these are all things that we think about. We've got teams that are working on these issues to try to understand how they affect our business and our ability to provide our 44 members with electricity. But it takes something like what we have with the Colorado mine to really capture people's attention about what the impact of regulations or legislative action or even a lawsuit have on communities. And that's what we're seeing right now in northwestern Colorado with the events that really kicked off in 2013 and came to a head on May 8th when a federal district court judge in Denver found in favor of Wild Earth Guardians in a lawsuit, not against Tri-State or against the mine, but a suit against the Department of Interior, Office of Surface Mining, that 8 years ago, the federal government did not appropriately engage the public or appropriately perform an environmental analysis during the mine permitting process. Those actions occurred, like I said, 8 years ago, 2006-2007 timeframe. And this is part of an environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act. The permitting, the mining plans, the work that we actually do is regulated by the state. That authority is delegated from the federal government. This is a really important point to make. Tri-State Colorado Mine is in complete environmental compliance with all of our permits. We perform well. Our employees do an exemplary job. Their environmental stewardship, their conservation ethic, their focus on safety is remarkable. This really is a challenge to the process that the federal government put in place in their environmental review. But what this has done is kicked off a flurry of activity in northwest Colorado that has worked its way all the way back to Washington, D.C. Following the judge's decision in May, the order that he put forward gave the Office of Surface Mining 120 days to perform the environmental analysis that he's requiring, or, as he said in his order, there's a potential that he could vacate the mining permit. If that were to happen, we would have to stop mining and stop activities at Kalawao Mine. Very concerning to us, but much more concerning to our employees, to the residents of northwest Colorado, to the counties, to Routt County, to Moffett County, to Rio Blanco County, to Hayden, to Meeker, to Craig. Just this would have an incredible impact if we were to get to a point where we could no longer have ongoing mining operations at Kalawao Mine. The mine employs 220 people. We've done the economic analysis. When you look at the economic throughput that's a result of that mine operating in northwest Colorado, it's an impact of about $200 million per year, just for the mining operations, not including what happens at Craig Station or anything else that we're doing. So this is a big deal to folks. This is really where these issues come home and have an immediate impact on people. I think that's one of the key points here about the things we're talking about is that, eventually, whether it's legislation, regulation, or even litigation, people are affected, and we're very concerned about that. We have seen the community come together. We have seen the Office of Surface Mining taking a very aggressive approach to try to comply with the judge's order. We're very confident that they're moving forward in a very brisk pace and a very deliberate way to satisfy the judge's order within a 120-day period. But we're doing everything that we can do at Tri-State and in Kalawao Mine to ensure that mining operations can continue. So that includes making sure that we are providing all the information that we can to the Office of Surface Mining so they can complete their important work. That also means that we're challenging the decision from the judge. And we have filed a notice of appeal with the appellate court. We have also asked the judge in the district court for a stay pending that appeal. So we will do anything and everything that we can do to ensure that mining operations continue. We want to see the Office of Surface Mining be able to complete their work successfully and present that back to the court. There has been a thorough beginning to that process, starting with a public process with a meeting on June 10th in Craig, where the public was invited in by the Office of Surface Mining to learn about that process and provide comments. We're encouraged that they're well on their way to complete that work, but we are nonetheless concerned, and we're going to take every step that we can. I think we need to recognize the very strong support that Tri-State, the mine, our employees, our communities have received from Governor Hickenlooper, from Senators Gardner and Bennett, from Congressman Tipton, and even in Tri-State's, where our headquarters is in Westminster, Colorado, Congressman Perlmutter. They have all been very strong in their support for us. They have contacted Sally Jewell, who is the Secretary of the Interior, to encourage her to take every action that her department can to ensure that OSM completes this work. In some cases, they've asked the agency to appeal the decision. So we're seeing a tremendous amount of support around these jobs, these communities, the great work that we do here in Northwest Colorado. But it touches folks, and we're hearing that. There's been a tremendous amount of media attention, really elevating the issues that come around what happens when energy jobs are affected. And we're grateful for that. I can tell you we are humbled by the support that we've received. The community has carried itself in a wonderful way, given the risks that they're feeling. They're holding their heads up, and we're all working together to move forward and address the issues. So the credit to the Routt County Commission for their support, and to citizens across Northwest Colorado that have really come to the aid of their brothers and sisters in the community, and we're grateful for that.
Thank you, Lee Boughey. Lee, I want to start with you real quick, because it's such a local issue, but you've talked about this coalition that has sort of come together, and it's really remarkable. You think about this is not something that necessarily follows a strict ideological or political sort of line or anything. You're seeing it from both sides, but one of the things I've wondered is, what does this mean? First of all, talk about that coalition. You touched on it a little bit, but also this. If this is a really bad pun, is Kalawao the canary in the coal mine for the coal mining industry? You've got to have others. If Wild Earth Guardians prevails, what does this do for coal? What does it mean for coal miners, not just in Colorado, but in other states?
Well, I think, you ask 10 different people about coal or energy, you're going to get 10 different answers. But I think what we can all agree on is that jobs are important, our economy is important, the ability to fund our school systems, to fund our local services, to keep people working, to keep people at home and not have to leave Northwest Colorado for other employment. Those jobs at Caldwell Mine matter. And that extends out, I think, to energy jobs in this state. I think if you crunch some of the numbers, it's $40 billion worth of activity between mining and oil and gas, a significant part of the Colorado economy. Well, we've seen support from across both sides of the aisle. I think it's because this is an issue that's about jobs and livelihoods, people's hopes, their aspirations, their ability to stay in these communities. And whether it's Governor Hickenlooper, Senator Bennett, Congressman Perlmutter with the Democrats, or Cory Gardner and Scott Tipton with the Republicans, they all agree that these jobs are important and that the work that is done at Caldwell Mine is important. It needs to continue. And so this issue has really brought folks that may see things differently when it comes to energy and even coal, brought them together in the defense of Northwest Colorado, and we're grateful for that. Second part of your question, I think we're going to be able to move forward. I think we're going to be able to work through this. It's going to take a lot of time, but I'm optimistic that that we'll be able to move forward. But I think it's a lesson for all of us that as we look at policies, as we look at regulation, as we look at litigation, ultimately these issues are going to have effect on people and families and communities and their ability to sustain themselves. And that needs to be a part of this debate. When we look at regulation, when we look at litigation, we've got to keep in mind the cost. We've got to keep in mind timelines. We've got to keep in mind technology. All these different parts that allow us to meet what may be the goals of our policymakers, but do it in a way that preserves our economy, keeps electricity affordable, and protects people.
Go ahead.
I'd point out, to kind of follow up on Lee's comments, if you look at the resources that the environmental movement has to first take out coal and then take out gas, it's truly breathtaking. It pales in comparison to what the fossil fuel industries, the utilities bring to the table. In 2011, New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg pledged $50 million to the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign. Just this year, he pledged $30 million more and was immediately indicated that the Hewlett Foundation was going to match his $30 million. For those playing at home, that's $110 million from just two billionaires. That doesn't include Tom Steyer's Next Gen Climate Action Fund, which at least brags it's spending $100 million. And for, foundations you've never heard of, like the Energy Foundation out of San Francisco, that's spending $20 to $25 million a year in the States, first to eliminate the nation's coal fleet, and now, as many of you know, the Sierra Club's next major campaign is Beyond Gas. And as Dan spoke, what the ozone rule does in part is it shuts down gas production in Colorado. It shuts down gas production in Wyoming. It shuts it down in New Mexico. You can't do anything if the 65 part per billion ozone standard goes into play. And Politico, the Washington, D.C. magazine, about a month ago, had a really well-researched piece, and the point it made was about the environmental movement's triumph on this anti-fossil front. And part of it is they are everywhere. They are filing lawsuits against the Caldwell mine. They are filing lawsuits. They're in every public utility commission. They're in every state air commission. They're filing NEPA lawsuits anywhere and everywhere. And I don't generally believe in conspiracies, but this is one that I believe in because I've seen it in action. These folks are dedicated. They are full of moral fervor because they think they're fighting global catastrophe, and they have enormous resources that the industry could only dream about.
Go ahead, Dan, and then I've got a question for two of you.
I mean, just to pile on, I totally agree. I mean, these are not the environmentalists of yesteryear. They are organized, sophisticated. They're well funded. And we like to say, sort of the old adage was NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. And the new philosophy of this movement we call is literally bananas. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And that is the way we see it. And it's funny, but it's not an exaggeration.
And I got to say, just to add to that, the Independence Institute, and thank goodness Steamboat is doing this, is having this panel, but nobody has done at the state level free market energy policy. We are one of, if there are 6 of us in the country that do it, state-based think tanks looking at this from a state level, I'd be shocked. So there just aren't resources on our side. The environmental left is very well funded, and they have a number of different little think tanks. And what we have are good utilities like Tri-State. We have great people like Dan and Ray, and then this sort of coalition that has been band-aided together with not a lot of resources. But I do think we have at least managed to raise the level of the dialogue. And speaking of that, one of the things I think that's going to be on the floor of the legislature next year, at least if I have anything to say about it, and being married to a state lawmaker helps. So Dan and Ray, when these 2 regulations collide, what does that mean for Northwest Colorado? I mean, I'm thinking, okay, we're all focused on the Clean Power Plan and possibly what happens with Craig Power or your electricity rates going up. But then we have ozone coming in where we're not even going to be able to develop energy. And if you put the loss of GDP and the loss of jobs, what does that mean to this community, to these folks right here?
Well, it's tough to tell precisely. The Energy Information Administration and NERC, which is a reliability organization, assumes that 1/3 of the nation's coal fleet goes away by 2030. 2 of the largest coal stations in Colorado are within 50 miles of here. So you do the math. The next question is what does it do to rates? And one of the challenges that I know probably keeps Lee and his colleagues awake at night, and rural electric folks, is this rule is going to disproportionately affect utilities that are coal-centric, right? It only makes sense. It's also going to disproportionately affect utilities that have less scale. By definition, rural electric co-ops don't have the scale that, say, an Xcel Energy does, Southern California Edison. How that works its way out, I have joked probably cruelly to some other folks in the co-op world, is you either go bankrupt or ask for a bailout, because there aren't a lot of great options if the full force of this rule hits you. Like I said, it was gallows humor, Lee. You don't have to subscribe to that.
Yeah, poor Lee's thinking, yeah. Not good news. Dan, what happens when these 2 rules collide? We have the finalized rule for the Clean Power Plan at the end of August, beginning of September, the rule on ozone coming out in October. What happens when these 2 collide?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I think one, Ray's right. It's going to be sort of difficult to predict. Every state is sort of doing their own maneuvering. It's going to play out a little bit in the courts, but certainly if it proceeds as EPA and the administration has planned, the electricity rule, the power plant, is going to shut down a ton of coal. The ozone rule is going to make it very difficult, if not impossible, to replace that coal with gas. What are states going to do for electricity demand? I don't know. Wind and solar don't run 24/7. You have a base load issue. I think sort of more indirectly, we have to remember, beyond the hit to coal production and utilities, you have to look at your electricity consuming sectors, right? Colorado, you guys can correct me, but I think roughly electricity here is about 11 cents a kilowatt hour, maybe 10 or 11 cents. California is 15 cents a kilowatt hour. California doesn't have any coal. Colorado has a lot. Wyoming is 7.5 cents a kilowatt hour, even cheaper than Colorado because Wyoming is almost all coal. And so in my mind, there's almost an attempt here to sort of Californianize the electricity system. And if all this coal goes away and you can't replace with gas, you're going to be like California in terms of the rates you pay. And frankly, you will not have manufacturing there, which is obviously the backbone of the affordable electricity economy. So.
And other sectors are going to be impacted by this? You said manufacturing, so we're not just talking about the energy industry.
Well, manufacturing will flee to lower rates almost immediately if it can. The greatest example of this that's so rich in irony, I can hardly contain myself when I tell the story, is as part of the stimulus package, NCAR, which is in Boulder, Colorado, got money to buy a new supercomputer. Supercomputers use enormous amounts of energy, and strangely enough, there is a requirement that the government look for the lowest cost energy when buying a supercomputer that is going to do modeling on climate change, incidentally enough. Can anybody guess where that supercomputer is?
I think Lee's got the answer.
It is in Cheyenne, Wyoming, not Boulder, Colorado.
Well, and to speak to point that Ray made, when Tri-State and our member electric cooperatives were growing the most rapidly in the 70s and the 80s, by federal government policy, we were dissuaded or almost prohibited from using natural gas as a resource. So we went into a heavy development of coal resources in general in the industry, particularly in the West, and that's why you see Craig Station here, Hayden Station, facilities across the West. So not too long after that, we find ourselves in a position where federal policy has turned right around to say, let's look at fuel switching under the Clean Power Plan, let's bolster natural gas, let's reduce our ability to use coal. It speaks to some of the challenges of picking winners and losers and trying to dictate which fuels we're going to use for energy, for any use, really.
Go ahead, Dan.
One other quick point, with respect to the energy users, we have a phenomenon called carbon leakage, and so if these rules go into place and the Obama administration sort of declares victory against climate, there's a lot of folks out there arguing that you may not actually even reduce emissions at all because most manufacturing and related sectors are trade exposed. So iron and steel, pulp and paper, they're just going to pick up and move to the country that does not have these restrictions in place. And in that case, you don't reduce emissions, you just move emissions and the jobs that go with them out of the U.S. and into other countries.
Last question before we get to the audience participation is, so Tri-State is seeing one of its assets, Kalawao, under this lawsuit, and we have a judge that agreed with Wild Earth Guardians. Tell me about, real quickly, ozone and the Clean Power Plan, legal muster, legal scrutiny, authorities of states to even implement these. I know you touched on it, but let's see, will these survive legal scrutiny?
Well, it's administrative law, Amy, and so the opening prediction is anything goes quite often. I think any fair-minded lawyer would say what the EPA is doing with the Clean Power Plan stretches the bounds of the Clean Air Act. We left the statutory language of the Clean Air Act in Omaha, and we're in Steamboat right now. That said, the relevant court that is going to hear this appeal or that EPA is going to take steps to make sure is the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. That court has 4 new judges that have just been appointed because the filibuster was eliminated by Senator Reid. Those 4 judges are all appointed by the president, and I think it's widely believed that those DC Circuit appointments were made for the express purpose to wade through the regulatory agenda of this administration. And as I said briefly during my presentation, there's a perverse genius to the way EPA has constructed this rule, because what they have done with this interim target, and you saw in the slide on Colorado, how the 2020 interim goal is the big lift when those carbon reductions have to come. Now, I think everybody thinks the EPA may give a little bit on that interim goal, but not the whole way. But what that interim goal does is it forces utilities like Lee's, it forces Excel, it forces all the players in Colorado and around the country to make decisions now to retire that coal. Because if I say tomorrow I'm going to close down the coal plant, I'm going to be lucky to get substitute capacity online in 5 years. And that doesn't assume that everybody in the country isn't ordering turbines like crazy and building natural gas pipelines like crazy. So the court process takes 3, 4, 5 years to wind up to the Supreme Court. And as I said, if by 2019 the Supreme Court says, no, EPA, you never had authority to do it, but in the meantime, state plans have gone to the EPA that are closing a third of the nation's coal fleet, the cake is baked.
Dan, do you want to weigh in on the legal scrutiny for these, or have we even gotten there yet?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer.
Thank goodness.
I can read and listen to our lawyers and look, I mean, I think you look at it on paper and you look at the Clean Air Act, and you think this thing has a huge hurdle to overcome, but at the same time, as Ray's pointing out, look, you got the packed DC circuit, and you got a Supreme Court that's divided 4-4 with a swing vote, and so it's kind of sad, but the state of affairs is it could come down to, you know, the whim of a single Supreme Court justice and sort of the, you know, the long-term fate here of the electricity system, but, you know, certainly a lot remains to be seen.
I don't know.
I will add one thing, though, and that is you have 15 states suing right now saying this is illegal, you can't even go down this road. My understanding is many more are going to join, and I think it's pretty unprecedented, you know, to have potentially 20 or more states suing to block a regulation coming like right out of the gate. So that ought to send a pretty strong signal to the court.
No, and there are states that have come out and said very loudly, we're just not going to submit a plan. Texas has said as much. Oklahoma said a version of that. Senator McConnell has given, has written an op-ed that says, just say no. There is plenty of state pushback, but it's a dangerous game for the states in that they're setting themselves up for a federal plan that may be worse than a plan that they could divide themselves. Colorado, incidentally, has indicated that it will be moving forward through the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment and filing a state plan.
Did you have anything to add on that, Lee, before we go to audience?
We've filed comments with the EPA on the Clean Power Plan, and first and foremost, we said this proposal needs to be shelved. As that may likely not happen, we did provide significant constructive comments about how they could take the plan and at least try to make it somewhat workable. As Ray was talking about, getting rid of the interim timelines, that 20 to 29 period of ramp up would be really important to give the utilities the time they need to put practices into place, to look at their fleets, to be able to begin to react in an appropriate time frame. We simply just don't move and make major decisions about how we dispatch power in 2-3 years. It's a really big machine that we have that provides the lights that always, for the most part, are on and are delivered to you in an affordable way. It's a lot of time to do this work. We are working constructively with the states. We are making the points that we still need to see technologies develop that can help us address emissions at our plants. You need technology developed to continually improve and to provide us with solutions that we can utilize. When you look at the Clean Power Plan and the 4 building blocks that Ray talked about, only one focuses on the emissions that come out of the power plants that the utility industry operate. The others have to do with fuel switching or renewable energy or energy efficiency, things that they likely don't have the authority to regulate the way they're approaching it. So we're really looking at, where do we provide input to the EPA, work with the states to be able to show where this plan is unworkable and make suggestions about how you could improve on it, but it's still a difficult proposition given the foundation they've set.
And there is a remarkable story that's been happening actually since the late 2000s, which is U.S. Carbon dioxide emissions have declined quite dramatically, not because of regulatory fiat, but because of fracking. And $2.50 natural gas will have any utility switching because of market conditions toward burning more natural gas as baseload fuel over coal when it's cheaper. So there is a great story here that has happened despite the regulatory overlay that's coming now.
Let's get some questions from the audience, if you all have them. You can ask questions about Kalawao Mine and the Wild Earth Guardians lawsuit, ozone, or carbon.
And let me say first, and I'll run up here with the
Okay.
microphone, just so you know, we did invite Governor Hickenlooper, and because of a scheduling problem, he could not come, but we did invite him, and we would have loved to have him here. Okay, question?
Yeah, we've not built a nuclear plant in the United States in, 35, 40 years. Could we see a recovery of the nuclear industry with the need to meet the CO2 requirements that you're talking about?
There are a couple nuclear units actually currently under construction in Texas and Georgia. Lee and I were actually talking about this just before the panel. The short answer is that the capital cost of nuclear is so enormous that, one, no one's going to build nuclear without government loan guarantees, and pretty massive government loan guarantees. And two, you're going to have pretty significant rate increases that would be associated with that. I would agree that it's actually, if decarbonization is the moral imperative that of the moment, the realistic answer is nuclear because it is zero carbon emissions. But the environmental movement has its own problems and contradictions on that because large parts of the environmental movement hate nuclear too. But right now it's really a cost issue that is making nuclear not feasible.
Yeah, we've, as a not-for-profit wholesale power supplier to 44 rural electric co-ops, including some of the smallest co-ops in the country, we just don't have the risk profile or the balance sheet to be able to pursue a large nuclear project. I think if utilities were to do that, they need to really come together and share those risks, and you see that with some of the projects. We have looked at just to educate ourselves and sort of the newer technologies and small modular type plants that might sometime in the future provide that emissions-free alternative that you can dispatch. But it's something that is far off.
We have another question back here.
I think this might be for Lee. We've got these rules potentially coming so fast, and as you say, front-loaded. When we committed to the selective catalytic reduction projects here locally, did we think we were going to be in the clear for 25 years or so, and now we're being caught
Absolutely.
blindsided?
We are investing in the long-term operation of Craig Station. We believe Craig Station is critical to delivering affordable, reliable power. We're investing in that plant for the long term, and we fully intend to keep it running. So what we've done on 2 of our units at Craig Station is we're installing selective catalytic reduction systems, which help to address new visibility standards in the West. You've heard about the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act and Xcel Energy. That was under the same visibility regulations. We firmly believe that coal is an important part of our generation fleet, and rather than look to make a wholesale switch to natural gas generation, we think we need to make the investments in Craig Station, as we have done in the past, to remain in compliance and operate for the long term.
This is for Ray. Does Wild Earth Guardians have anything planned as an alternative, or are they just hopeful that mankind dies off the planet?
And the environmental groups that we generally, and I should add, I represent investor-owned utilities. I represent the largest REA in the state. And have worked for fuel suppliers as well. You've got the deep green folks, you've got the moderate green folks, and both of them have a lot of money. They have a lot of faith that renewables are going to be able to become an increasing portion of the generation mix. When I look at that, honestly, what you'd probably need is some quantum breakthrough in battery storage, which, if it happens, bully for all of us, but no one, I think, plausibly sees that, except maybe Elon Musk.
That's a subsidy.
Yeah, but because of the intermittency of the wind and solar, nothing substitutes for baseload power.
One comment, there are two other fellows and myself in here who are taking a look at local coal situation, and clearly the 20-mile coal mine that's owned by Peabody is under the same attacks that you guys were talking about ozone and the clean power plant. We've done a little bit of research. The production of that coal mine is down 8% in 2014 versus 13. The number of full-time employees is down 16%. One other quick fact that I think is important to us as to how does all this affect us. The 20-mile plant is the #1 property taxpayer in Routt County at about 6%, $2,771,000. If that goes away because of some of the things that you all are talking about, that tax base goes away and the county has to come up with more money through taxes or something else to meet those demands. One other quick thing. You talked about the fact that a couple of states are fighting this. Governor Hickenlooper is not fighting this. Senate Bill 13252, which he gleefully signed, was a negative on the coal industry in the state of Colorado. My comment, and it's not a question, but yeah, I'll ask you, Ray. Don't you think it would be good if the 60 or so people in here who feel badly about what's happening to our industry in our area wrote a letter to Governor Hickenlooper and said, Governor, would you please stand up for coal?
I think it would be. I don't think it's going to move him. I think the governor is caught between his political coalitions, and he has a remarkably, I think, forward-looking view on fracking, and I think he has to earn back some virtue points with his environmental supporters by letting coal take the hard knocks. Now, that's not to say that the legal implementation of at the state level of this plan is going to be easy, and there are not plenty of interested parties who aren't going to try and make it not easy, probably including Lee's company, probably including Amy. Well, definitely including Amy. But it is, from a legal perspective, and that's why I brought homework for anybody who's interested, this rule is asking states, and particularly state air regulators, to basically subsume the powers of the PUC. Well, last I checked, you don't get to do that unless the state legislature says you can do it. And so it is not a straight path for EPA to get this done, even though from what I've been told by officials with the state, EPA looks at Colorado as probably the only interior west state that they have a chance of any modicum of cooperation on this rule with.
Let me, something though that you brought up real quick, the Wild Earth Guardian lawsuit, to me, so we are looking at the impact of mining on climate as opposed to looking at the emissions from an existing plant. This to me, I look at this and the environmental left have sort of upped the ante with the Colorado, with the Wild Earth Guardians lawsuit. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but so even if you could, even if we weren't burning coal in Colorado, you may not even be able to mine it because if this lawsuit prevails. So you couldn't sell it to somebody, to China or India or someplace else where they may want it. That's my, and I don't know, Lee, I mean, maybe you can, this to me is a different lawsuit than others that we have seen.
Well, it's one of the challenges that comes out of this is when you look at when the federal government goes through the NEPA process and looks at the impact or looks at the decisions that that they make in their environmental review, how far out do you go? In this case, the judge ordered that an emissions analysis be done for the combustion of the coal. You do apply that in other federal permitting processes to oil and gas leases, where you might extend out the oil and gas environmental review to you operating your vehicles. How far do you take it, and what's reasonable? It's one of the questions that comes out of this decision that people should be thinking about.
It just seems like this has gone one step further. Maybe I have misread that. I'm not an attorney, but go ahead, Dan. You had a comment on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would agree. That's, the NEPA rule that this lawsuit has been brought under for 45 years, it's an important law. It's meant that when you're going to develop something, you're going to take a look and make sure you're not going to harm the water or air in the immediate area. But now this lawsuit is saying, well, we're not just looking at whether or not you can responsibly conduct operations in this immediate area. We're going to look at the product that you're producing and what happens to it. And so look, from the chamber, the broader business community, we can see this as a slippery slope. Who's to say you're not going to look at an auto manufacturing facility and say, well, you're making these cars here. I'm not looking at your facility itself. I'm going to decide those cars are going to burn gasoline, which is going to emit carbon, so you can't have your permit. Or washing machines, and on and on and on. Where does that end? You can make the same argument. And so it's a huge concern that this could really spread.
Yeah, and we become an 11th century kind of economy. Anyway, so I just wanted to kind of, I think that's where we were going. We had some more questions?
Yeah, your last comment suggested that the lawsuit is really based on a supposed flaw in the OSM process when they approved Carlisle's permit back in 06-07. It's my understanding that concurrent with that process, they also were approving a parcel at Trapper Mine, which is not part of the lawsuit because that parcel's already been mined. That's history. It's probably been mined and probably already reclaimed. My question is, if the lawsuit suggests that there was a flawed protocol and process, how many other approvals during 06 and 07 are ticking time bombs out there that are just waiting for these folks to pick up on?
Yeah. That's a good question. Specific to Trapper Mine, Trapper was part of the lawsuit. The judge in his order didn't find there was a remedy for the Trapper situation since the majority of the coal that was mined under the permit in question had already been mined. There was very little left, so the judge didn't see fit to address that. He's focused his order on Carlisle Mine, and since there's considerably more coal left to be mined under the permit in question. But
Okay. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions if they're quick.
It strikes me that the real issue that you're facing is public relations and education. As I listen to your comments, I don't want to be critical, but this whole notion that we're being outgunned by the environmentalists, what's really happening is there's a very organized minority, but it's a minority. And I think what really has to happen is, instead of being entirely reactive, which is just my impression, there really has to be an effort to educate and move forward so that people are not frightened, but they're informed. Sure. My question is, what do you plan to do to be forward-thinking to change the public dialogue so that you're not being reactive like you are now? Because I think you've got an opportunity in places like Moffat County where the population is now galvanized and they understand these threats.
I think one of the challenges the utility industry faces is that we do a pretty good job delivering affordable power that's reliable. And many, understandably, take their electricity or their energy for granted. It's always available, it's always on. It's issues like this that begin to raise the consideration of these issues. And these things are never good things, but certainly to create awareness and create an understanding of the value that energy industry utilities provide, not just for the quality of life, but for our productive capacity, is critical. And so, this is an issue. At least the suit and challenge that we're facing is that it is getting people's attention, and we're seeing a bipartisan support for these jobs and this effort. People's recognition that affordable, reliable power, in part, comes from the availability of coal. and that coal is an important part of our energy economy. So issues like this are helpful, but we do need to be more proactive. We do need to bolster energy literacy across the country so that folks understand where their electricity comes from, where the value is, and understand the risks that are out there. So we support a number of different campaigns that help to build awareness. But in this world where there's so much attention to so many other things, it's hard to get people's arms wrapped around energy and get their attention focused on it. It's something that we think about every day, and we're working on. It's sometimes hard to break through.
Let me,
I think you're exactly right about the reactivity.
can I weigh in on that real quick too? You make a great point, and it is very well taken, because the environmental movement, you could have gone down on the 16th Street Mall in 1980 and had somebody come up to you and say, do you have a minute for the environment? And they began, and we all just took power for granted, but I do think you're seeing a change in the narrative, and Lee and Tri-State and others are part of that, where stop apologizing for developing energy. The moral case for fossil fuels is being made. We stop apologizing and we start advancing affordable power, not reacting to their narrative, but putting forth our own, which is affordable, reliable, abundant power. And all of the miners in here, we should be treating them accordingly. Thank you for what you all do. And I think there was a question over there, I think.
We're going to do just two more quick questions. We have Jack Taylor has a question, and then we'll go over here.
We've got to. Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Thank you. I'm scared to death and have been for years about what's going to happen to our tax base when we lose our coal mines. And I thought it would be years out, but now it seems like it's right around the corner. And along with that is I'm looking for a common denominator, which goes to this gentleman's question about PR, of what we can tell Joe Sixpack what's going to happen to his electric bills over the next number of years. And actually, when the president came out with his campaign that it's going to be, expect your rates to go up drastically, and I've never heard a number put on that, but I hear as much as 50% over the next 10 years. By lightning calculations, that's 5% a year. So what has anybody done a real calculation on what we can tell people? And I think that would scare people. They say, hey, your electric bill is going to go up X number of dollars. And then it hits him in the pocket. He understands it. So has anybody run figures on that that we can pass on to people?
There have been a number of studies done. I'd be happy to get with you afterwards and share with you those. And I would just note, even EPA's numbers. EPA is saying you're going to have about, I believe, 8% electricity rate increase in 2020. Colorado was above that average. I think it was about 10%. EPA, of course, they're modeling lowballs it, et cetera. And so I think you're right. There is a lot to be said for those numbers. Part of the problem, obviously, with the messaging is that the bite is out, and so when you tell this to folks, they may recognize it, but even in the Northeast, which is sort of signed up for all this cap and trade, they actually haven't had the bite in terms of the hit to electricity prices, and so until they actually see that $20 on their electric bill, motivating them is a little more difficult.
Wouldn't it be great to have on your utility bill something that shows you what you're going to be paying in 2020, 2025, 2030, and so you all know you can start planning and budgeting?
Well, the one thing about all those projections, though, is if you really knew what the natural gas price was going to be in 2025, you wouldn't be on this dais. You would be a natural gas futures trader, and have a really nice house up here in Steamboat. And that's really the unknown factor, is what is the natural gas price going to be in 2020? If it's still $2.50, it's not going to be an enormous hit to customers. If it's $6, $7, $8, which is where you read some of the 10Ks of the natural gas producers, they think it's going to go, you've got a completely different political equation, and customers react. But Lee and Dan are right. The problem is the cause and effect. I decide to close my coal plant today, you're going to get the bill for that in 2021.
Yeah, we have a there's a campaign that we support called Keep Electricity Affordable. You can go to it at keepelectricityaffordable.org. That really is focused on just those issues, making sure that the threats to affordable electricity are elevated and provides great information about what those challenges are. Also talks about solutions, but make sure that the public can be engaged in a very understandable way about a lot of these issues, whether it's coal ash or ozone or the Clean Power Plan or any other issue that affects the utility industry, and educate them that these really do have an effect on you as a consumer. And you need to be concerned about these things and pay attention to these things. And hopefully you do create a more literate energy consumer that acts accordingly.
Okay, our reporter is going to ask you your questions afterwards, or his questions afterwards. So I want to thank our panelists. They all came here at their own expense.